Prodigy of Atlantis, a paper on the alignments of pyramids with Orion's belt, by Jonathan Barlow Gee, Tallahassee, Florida, USA, for the Pythagorean Order of Death, January 9th, 2013. Introduction. Knowns and unknowns. Quote, "There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know. End quote. United States Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. When looking back at the past, we must remember our place here in this present makes our knowledge of the past subjective to the here and now. We are standing in the ever-shifting sands of time, and all that we can do is hope that they will shift and reveal some ancient secret, some long-buried treasure. Such was the mission of Horace Francois Sebastiane de la Porta and the French consulate for the Levant under French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Some say Nostradamus predicted the first Antichrist of his three famous predictions for comings of the devil incarnate as being none other than Napoleon himself. Nostradamus's later picks, according to subsequent scholars, include Hitler as the second Antichrist, and a third Antichrist still, they say, yet to come, named by Nostradamus Mabus, and described as wearing a blue turban and seeking to conquer Europe. De la Porta, around the turn of the 19th century, sojourned to Cairo, Egypt, and commissioned a book of illustrations be made of their journey along the way. During this period, in 1798, Napoleon himself was waging a war there following the Mediterranean naval campaigns of 1798 and the capture of Malta, which Napoleon had then used as a staging ground to conquer Alexandria, sending troops through their seaport to Cairo in Egypt and to Ottoman Syria. At the Battle of the Pyramids, so called then, now recalled as the Battle of Khobracate, Napoleon won a French victory and dispersed the opposing forces under Murad Bey and Ibrahim Bey of the Mamluks from Cairo, ending their 700-year rule there. However, 10 days later, Napoleon's fleet suffered a defeat by the British Navy under Admiral Horatio Nelson at the Battle of the Nile. During the French-Egyptian campaign, 151, 21 math, 3 astro, 17 engineers, 13 miners, 3 gunpowder, 4 architects, 8 artists, 10 draftsmen, 1 sculptor, 15 interceptors, 10 scribes, and 22 printers in Latin, Greek, and Arabic, so-called savants, of Napoleon's Commission des Sciences et des Arts, accompanied the French military through Cairo and catalogued their observations in the Description de l'Egypte, released from 1809 to 1829 as initially a 9-volume text, with 1 volume listing illustrations, with 10 volumes of illustrations, and subsequently as 37 volumes, with the first edition's volume 18 being split into 3, and a volume of maps being added. The 10 volumes of art consist of 894 plates from over 3,000 drawings, some containing over 100 individual engravings of flora and fauna. 38 of the plates are hand-colored, The rest of the second edition is in black and white. From the introduction to the 2001 Taschen German Publishing House edition by Gilles Neret, I quote, "Soldiers, from the height of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down on you." Thus Napoleon is said to have addressed his troops shortly before the Battle of the Pyramids, 21 July, 1798. His words aptly summarize the result of the Egyptian campaign, a military disaster which had extraordinary consequences for archaeology. Soldiers come and go, the pyramids remain. And therein lies the quandary in this modern, technologically driven era. Can we harness our people power to bridge the gap between our vapid attention spans as individuals and our herd mentality whenever in a crowd long enough to ponder an architectural archaeological mystery of the ancients first uncovered by the armies of Napoleon Bonaparte? Because if your answer is no, it cannot be so now, then I have nothing more to reveal to you at this time. And if your answer is yes, but I already know it all, then perhaps allow me to contradict you in that, but only to add to your knowledge base. So what dust has covered them? Having been swept to the side some time ago, what facts do we now know about the mystery of the pyramids and their builders? What awaits beneath the shifting sands of time? 1. Orion's Belt. Living as they did, some 4,500 years before us now, the Egyptians based their Sothic calendar on the heliacal rising of the Dog Star, the binary star system of Canis Major and Canis Minor they called Sirius, such that when the Dog Star first rose in the east just before dawn, it marked the time of their year to begin planting crops to harvest by autumn and to store to survive winter. Times, of course, are different now, and so we see Sirius, the Dog Star, rising now just before sunrise in the east in early winter. Sirius, the Dog Star, traipses ever at the heel of his master, the constellation just northeast of him, like the white dog at the heel of the traveler at the cliff in the Tarot trump card, the Fool. The master constellation of Sirius was called by the Egyptians Osiris, by the Romans as Orion, and by the Greeks as Hercules. Just as the binary star system of Sirius was constellated as canine in the zoomorphism of early astrology, so was Orion, his master, depicted as anthropomorphic, as an upright person with their arm outstretched toward the northeast constellation, which is the Bull constellation on the ecliptic zodiac, the sign called Taurus, that rises nowadays in midsummer. A different constellation occupies the place of sunrise along the ecliptic zodiac every 2,000 years or so, and each constellation takes up about 30 degrees of the 360-degree ecliptic cycle. Thus, there are 12 ages we call solar aeons, and during each, a different constellation of the zodiac occupies the rising sign position on the eastern horizon just before sunrise on any given date from any other aeon. This process is called precession, and it occurs due to the Earth's angle of inclination between our geographic pole and its ideal perfect position at 90 degrees from the solar equator's zodiac, ecliptic being about 23.5 degrees. A. The constellation in the North Hemisphere. Thus, the constellation of Orion although not on the ecliptic zodiac, and thus not part of its system of 12 solar aeons, nevertheless pivots its position in the sky along with the rest of the celestial dome that surrounds us with the firmaments of the heavens by night. It seems to perpetually follow the bull of heaven in the form of the constellation Taurus, and in turn to be perpetually pursued by the dog star, the binary system of Sirius A and B. According to Creedo Muttwa, an aboriginal tribesman of the Dogon people of central sub-Saharan Africa, continental primitivists, the celebration of the May pole derives from an originally very ancient Dogon ritual to celebrate their communication with beings or angels from the twin dog star constellation. This attestation may account for the earliest form of worship of this constellation pair in the region where, much later, the pyramids of Giza would be built. Geographically between the Dogon tribe's location in the middle of the African continent and the location of Giza near Cairo in Egypt to the northeast, where the pyramid complex has stood for around 4,500 years, are the Nubian Kushites of Sudan pyramids at Meroe, built from around 300 to around 1,700 years ago. The first Kushite kingdom's capital city was Kerma, and was absorbed into the Egyptian Empire by 3,500 years ago, after some 220 years of struggle. While the Egyptian Empire of the era used hieroglyphics, the Nubians wrote in Coptic, and the combination of these forms of alphabet would eventually yield the Phoenician basis for our own written letters today. A1. Upright orientation toward Polaris. The constellation Orion is oriented with his figurative feet facing toward the South Pole, the location of the continent Antarctica now, and with his head toward the direction of the North Pole, the location of the Arctic Ocean now, with his arms outstretched towards the west in the direction of the constellation Taurus, conceived as the bull of summer nowadays. In the middle of the year 2000, on May 5th, the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter all aligned briefly in the constellation Taurus between the bull's figurative horns. Some speculate this alignment has occurred before, and occurs in conjunction with the recent alignment on December 21st, 2012, of the Earth, the Sun, and galactic core that occurred in the winter solstice or midwinter constellation, Sagittarius, the figurative centaur archer, who, like Orion, also stretches out the reach of his arms, but toward the point along the Milky Way's river-like stellar hub of galactic core. If Orion, now a mid-autumn constellation, and Sagittarius, now a midwinter constellation, are both holding their arms outward toward these fixed points in the celestial sphere, then we can posit they do so for a reason that was known also to the ancients who designed these constellations' configurations as a star chart of the night sky. Those who invented the astrolabe for navigation of the seas may predate even our own species' earliest ancestors, the Kebaran cave dwellers of the Natufian era Levant. A2. Foot of constellation near Lepus, Rabbit. Hand near Taurus, Bull. Between the Canis Major and Canis Minor constellations, along the line of the three kings, or close clustering of the stars from left northeast to right southwest, Alnitak A, Zeta Orionis, Alnilam, Epsilon Orionis, and Mintaka, Delta Orionis, the belt star in Arabic, comprising Orion's belt, is the constellation Manoceres, the unicorn, and between Orion and Taurus is the constellation Ariadnes, the Po River. By far the most important, being the brightest and most easily visible trait of the Orion constellation, is the belt of the three king stars. If you draw a line between the middle star, Alnilam, and the star to its immediate right, Mintaka, and extend this line to the southeast from Alnilam in the direction of Alnitak A, you will find that Alnitak A is offset from this straight line by an angle of only about 10 to 12 degrees. As we shall soon see, this angle was built into the pyramid complex at Giza in Egypt, as well as much later, only around some 900 years ago, into that of the Mesoamerican capital, Teotihuacan. B. The myths associated with the constellation. There are varied myths recounting attributes to this anthropomorphic constellation. From every populated region around the world, even Australia and New Zealand in the furthest southern hemisphere latitudes able to see him, where the Belt constellation is oriented upside down, associated with a saucepan or pot, not unlike a south hemisphere equivalent of the Dipper version of the North Polar Bear constellation. In the Nazca Lines, enormous geoglyphs in the desert Ica region of Peru, the constellation Orion is depicted as a spider, where the head, facing west, would be equivalent to Mintaka, the abdomen to Alnilam, and the thorax to the east to Alnitak A. To firmly associate the mythology of this constellation to their reason for erecting the world's earliest pyramids, let us examine the myths of Egypt most closely, as well as those of Greece and Rome, from whence the modern name of the constellation derives. B1. Osiris. The Egyptian god Asar, Coptic Osiris, became the ruler of the dead because the Old Kingdom 5th dynasty pharaoh who began his cult was the bloodthirsty madman Unas, reigning from 4375 to 4345 years ago, whose sister wife, mythology recalls as Isis, was in reality Jedkare Isisi, and as they had no son but a daughter, Iput, their son, figuratively recalled as Horus, was their son-in-law and legal successor to the Egyptian empire, Teti. The myth of Osiris proceeds that Set, Greek Typhon, Coptic Apophis, the serpent god of the Nile River, conspired with 72 henchmen to betray and murder Osiris, but that Isis, his sister wife, using the alchemical magic of Thoth, the Egyptian god of the moon and over time, was able to resurrect him and bear with him their child, Horus, who eventually avenged his father and slew Set, although losing one eye in the combat while doing so. In reality, the pharaoh Unas erected a pyramid at Saqqara near the Step Pyramid of Djoser, northwest of the Old Kingdom capital city of Memphis, which was founded by Pharaoh Menes some 5,000 years ago. B2. Orion. According to Horace, Ode 3.27.18, to Homer, Odyssey, Book 5, line 283, and Virgil, Aeneid, Book 1, line 535, Orion as a constellation was named after a mythical hero, what was called in Aram a Nephilim, although little mention of him is made outside these sources, where he is described as having been born in Boeotia, blinded by Onipion, the father of Merope, only to recover his sight at Lemnos, and finally to have been slain by the arrow of Artemis on Crete in the form of a scorpion sting, the scorpion being translated with him to the sky as the zodiac midsummer sign Scorpio. There is little direct account of the hero by this name. Prior records to these, however, reveal much more and relate the character of Orion to both Hercules and Gilgamesh. In Hebrew, the constellation's name was Kesil, literally meaning the fool. B3. Gilgamesh, or Hercules. Hercules, or Heracles, was the Roman name for the Greek god Orion. In their myths, he was the son of Zeus Jupiter and the mortal woman Alcmene, though also technically Zeus Jupiter's great-granddaughter. While she was exiled to Thebes, by disguising himself as Amphitryon, the Theban general from Tyrenes in the eastern Peloponnese, whom had accidentally killed his father-in-law, his wife Alcmene's father, Elkitrion, king of Mycenae, while Amphitryon was being redeemed by Creon, his maternal uncle and king of Thebes. Gilgamesh, subject of the Mesopotamian epic, was based on King Bilgamesh of Uruk, Iraq, 4,500 years ago, in the first dynasty of the Sumerian kings list, according to which whom ruled for 126 years. In the Tunal inscription, Gilgamesh and his son Urlugal rebuilt the sanctuary of the goddess Ninlil in Tunal, a sacred section of the city of Nippur that, according to the Epic of Gilgamesh, written later, 3,800 years ago, it had been Gilgamesh himself whom had destroyed while in his youth. The epic recounts, in detail, Gilgamesh's fateful meeting with Enkidu, a wild man born in the forests and raised by animals, and their adventures killing Humbaba, a forest spirit guardian, the bull of heaven, sent to kill them by the goddess Ishtar, daughter of Ninlil, and finally Enkidu's death and Gilgamesh's period in exile, roaming the wilderness in a lion's skin, until being shown the way between the twin peaks into the tunnel where the sun sets and travels through to rise again in the morning, by a scorpion man in his scorpion woman wife. Gilgamesh travels this tunnel and meets Utnapishtim, his ancient ancestor, whom had survived a great flood, then returns to Uruk after losing the plant of immortality that had been Utnapishtim's parting gift to him when it was stolen at an oasis by a serpent. 2. Pyramids. The original pyramids were called mastabas, Arabic for benches, meaning house of eternity, and were little more than an above-ground burial mound encased in mud brick or stones from the nearby Nile River. On the roof of the mastaba was a trapdoor leading into the tomb itself, and a second such accessed the sirdab, Persian for cellar, where a statue of the deceased was walled into the masonry, connected by narrow air shafts, or altogether unconnected to the underground catacomb containing the cadaver. The earliest dates to the city of Abydos, meaning, in Egyptian hieroglyphics, the hill of the reliquary, that, according to myths, contained the head of Osiris. The Abydos necropolis of el-Ka'ab and the Saqqara, alt Saqqara necropolis, containing the pyramid of Pharaoh Unas, overlooking the Old Kingdom capital city Memphis, contained the earliest architectural developments of the mastaba into the pyramid design. The mastabas of the first dynasty simulated above-ground houses to contain the sarcophagus and various forms of funerary offerings in different rooms. The step, or bent mastaba, was typical by the second and third dynasties, where the tomb was subterranean and connected to the roof by trapdoors leading to stairwells and air shafts. In the fourth dynasty, 4613 to 4494 years ago, tombs were hewn like caves into cliff faces of sheer rock. In the 5th dynasty, mastabas were built with the chapel at the southern end of a rectangular base consisting of several rooms, a columned hallway, and sedab along a slightly inclined passageway from a main entrance, and the tomb itself being accessible below this from a stairway concealed below the center of the grand hallway. In the 5th dynasty, Unas reigned and built his pyramid at Saqqara, near the step pyramid of Djoser, which had been designed by Imhotep, supposedly the great architect of this first pyramid-shaped structure, prototype of the Egyptian deity Thoth or Tahuti. 2a. Main sites. Although we now know of the pyramids originating in Egyptian Africa, we have not yet explored the pyramids built in other regions of the world, although it should suffice to say their architecture began independently in much the same way, until it reached a culmination point, where cross-cultural saturation with previous pyramid-building cultures may have seeped in, at which point it began the construction of elaborate temples aligned with stellar constellations, culminating in the building of megalithic pyramids. We see this trend repeated throughout the world, in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Greece, Spain, China, Mesoamerica, North America, as well as during the Roman Empire, in medieval Europe, India, Indonesia, and Peru, South America, to mention only a few. Their low point, architecturally speaking, came during the medieval European Dark Ages, when they were reduced to being merely underground catacombs connected by hidden passageways near the sites of Stone Age menhirs, monoliths, and herms, mile markers. 2A1 Egypt, 12,000 to 2,500 years ago. As stated, the practice of pyramid building began in ancient Egypt, northeastern continent of Africa, along the Nile River, which flows from south to north, the only river to do so, being the only river besides the Amazon River in South American Brazil, which flows north to south, to run opposite the direction of all rivers flowing toward the equator. The earliest mastabas in the southern original sources of the Nile River evolved into the later step pyramids of the northern cities along the river. The peak of pyramid building is, beyond par, the Giza necropolis near Cairo, Egypt. These three pyramids were built to honor the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, Khufu, Greek Cheops, his son Khafre, Greek Khephren, and grandson Menkaure. The Pyramid of Khufu was said by Herodotus, the Histories, 2nd book, numbers 124 to 128, to have taken 10 years to plan and 20 years to construct, and was concluded 4,560 years before now. 2A, 1A, culture, religious, political, economic beliefs. The period of the 4th dynasty in the Old Kingdom of the Egyptian Empire was the first civilization of sufficient size and technical ability in the area capable of constructing these massive nummullite limestone megaliths. Originally, their exterior faces were surfaced with a coating of light white limestone, so-called Tura limestone, quarried from the eastern shores of the Nile and from no more than 200 to 400 meters to the south, where the quarries for the core stones were located. To construct the Great Pyramid for the tomb of Pharaoh Khufu, 6,500,000 tons of 2,500,000 limestone cubes weighing 2.5 tons each were hewn into 127 by 127 by 71 centimeter units and moved into 210 layers, 146 meters tall, in a pile surrounding the central burial chambers and the passageway to access them. The percentage of building materials is such that 90% of the blocks are below the 100-meter height level, around layer 150, counting them from the ground level upward, while only 3% remain in the upper 46 meters of building area above this height. The shape of the pyramid was as a square 440 cubits per side, piled up toward the center to a height of 280 cubits, with 356 exposed blocks per each of its 4 faces, at an interior angle of no greater than 60 degrees in the interior base, and no less than 43.9 degrees in the upper interior, with the average slant being between 54.46 degrees and 51.8 degrees for the outer casing stones. The same ratio of base unit side length to height yields the lowest common denominator of 11 seked per side by a height of 14 and 17.8 layered steps. The ratio of the perimeter to the height, 1760 over 280 cubits, is equal to 2 pi, to an accuracy of better than 0.05%, corresponding to the circumference over radius measurement for pi as 22 over 7 when calculated as a circle. During these 20 years, building this pyramid required a workforce of untold sum. For those 20 years, 13,200 people, at least, on average 20,000 and 40,000 at most, are said to have moved 3 stones every minute, 180 blocks per hour, 12 per hour minimum, working day and night, at 800 cubic tons a day with 10-hour workdays. Quarrying the stones took even longer. On average, some 27 years would be necessary to quarry and transport the required 500,000 tons of mortar and the 2.8 to 5.9 million tons, 137.38 meters cubic, of limestone, 8,000 tons from Aswan, over 500 miles south along the Nile, the rest from Tura and Masara, across and south a short ways up the Nile River. Pharaoh Khufu's vizier, Hemon, is credited as its architect. It is written, "He would but lift his hand, and the strength of 20,000 men would hoist up their ropes and lift the stones, and he would but let his hand drop, and they would let slacken their hold." This was not even the only massive megalithic building project undertaken during this time either. The Wadi al-Gharawi flood wall, called the Dam of the Pagans, of 100,000 cubic meters of rock and rubble, was built between 4,686 and 4,498 years ago, about 25 kilometers due south of Cairo. This project is likely to have been overseen by Vizier Hemon under Pharaoh Khufu as well. During this time, Egyptian mythology, largely gleaned from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, called Coming Forth from Darkness into the Clear Light of Day, or simply the Papyrus of Ani, describe Egyptian funerary rites in great detail, and deal largely with their religious ritual beliefs in metempsychosis, the belief in an afterlife of the soul beyond the death of its incarnation into flesh. So these pyramids were created as large ceremonial working spaces to practice their religious rituals of mummification and metempsychosis. The body of the royal pharaoh would first be dressed accordingly in the king's chamber, at the central core of the above-ground structure of the Great Pyramid. then placed in his royal sarcophagus in the Queen's chamber. Below this, and separated from it by the grand gallery sloping hall. Following these treatments, the body was then interred a while in the lowest subterranean chamber of roughly hewn cavernous rock before being removed for its official burial in a separate mastaba. 2A2 Yucatan 2,000 to 500 years ago. The most recent builders of megalithic pyramids were in the Yucatan Peninsula, far across the Atlantic Ocean from the origins of the craft in Egypt, closer to the Amazon River of Brazil in South America than to the Nile River of Egypt in Africa. Just as throughout Egypt, there are known to be more than 80 varied pyramid sites, there are countless buildings scattered across northern South America and the Yucatan Peninsula, connecting it to North America via Mexico. And their culture seems to mimic, in many ways, the culture of pyramid construction at its height in the times of the 4th and 5th dynasties of the Old Kingdom Egyptian Empire. The primary pyramid complex we will examine in this region is Teotihuacan, in the Mexico Basin, some 49 kilometers northeast of Mexico City. This name, in Aztec Nahuatl, means where man met the gods, and the city served as the capital of the Mixtec multicultural empire, with a population of perhaps 125,000 or more people at its peak around 900 to 750 years ago. 2A Culture: religious, political, economic beliefs. Teotihuacan's main complex is comprised of 3 megalithic pyramid monuments, arranged along a straight, wide road called the Avenue of the Dead, or Micutli in Nahuatl, with the, from nearly exact magnetic north, 15.5 degrees from geographic north to south, Pyramid of the Moon, the Pyramid of the Sun, and the Citadel, or Temple, of Quetzalcoatl, or Kukulkan, along it on the eastern side. Teotihuacan's Pyramid of the Sun is the 3rd largest pyramid now known, following the Pyramid of Khufu in Giza, Egypt, and the Pyramid of Cholula to Quetzalcoatl in Puebla, Mexico. From around the same era, around 2,300 to 1,100 years ago. However, unlike the Puebla Pyramid, and unlike the Giza necropolis, Teotihuacan is comprised of 3 pyramids arranged along an exact line. The Pyramid of the Sun, at its completed parameters, was 225 meters across and 75 meters tall, with a slope per side of 223.5 meters at 32.494 degrees angle of inclination. Its volume is, at present, 1,184,828.3 cubic meters, and it is located above a man-made tomb hewn from a lava tube cave considered to be associated with Tecumseh, the place of human origin, according to Oahu legends, due to the Pyramid of the Sun's exact alignment with sunrise on August 12th and April 29th, August 12th being the traditional Mixtec New Year's Day, celebrating the origin of the long count calendar. There appears to have been ritual human sacrifice in the form of burial alive, practiced at the nearby Pyramid of the Moon. And there remain unexplored hidden chambers beneath both these pyramids and the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, called Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan. Surrounding the Temple of the Feathered Serpent is the Ciudadela, an enclosed compound capable of holding 100,000 people in about 700,000 cubic meters of area. Little is known about the culture of this city's original inhabitants, and it laid abandoned from the drought and famine period of 1475 to 1474 years ago, and was used as a place of pilgrimage for Aztecs by the Columbian era 608 years ago, who identified it with the myth of Tolan, the place where the sun was created. 2A3. Elsewhere, above ground. However, as mentioned, there are pyramids built, literally, all over the world. There is no single list of them all. There are 135 known of in Egypt, the Napata and Meroe pyramids in the Sudan, as recently as 1,700 years ago, Nigerian mud pyramids, Greek pyramids in Pausanias 800 years ago, Hellenikon and Ligruio near Epidaurus, the pyramids of Guaymar on the island of Tenerife in the Canary Islands near Spain, the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang of China's pyramid, and those of the subsequent Han Dynasty emperors. The Mexican and Mesoamerican pyramids, Monk's Mound at Cahokia, with a larger base than the Khufu pyramid, and various burial mounds throughout North America, the Roman pyramid of Cestius 2,100 years ago, near Porta San Paolo, and another in Falicon, France, which is not alone there from this era. The Chola Empire temples of South India, the Austronesian megalithic culture's step pyramids, called Pernden Bernudak, as found in Central and West Java, as well as in Peru, South America, in Corral and Tucum, to name only a few. Modern architects continue to exploit the pyramid motif in building designs, now mainly using glass walls and sometimes, as in many cases nowadays, having hundreds of rooms and serving as a privately operative building in themselves. Currently, the Khufu Pyramid of Giza is only the fourth tallest pyramid-shaped structure in the world, behind the over 300-meter tall Ryeogyong Hotel under construction in North Korea, The 300-meter Shard in London, UK, completed 2012, and the 250-meter Transamerica Pyramid in San Francisco, USA, completed 1972. Let's examine only a few of these such megalithic structures briefly, to better understand their pyramid-building culture's commonalities and differences. 2A, 3A, Cambodia, Angkor Wat, Peru, South America, Iran, Babylon, etc. Angkor Wat in Cambodia is the largest religious monument in the world and was commissioned as a capital of the Khmer Empire by King Suryavarman II around 1600 years ago. Angkor Wat is designed to symbolize Mount Meru, home of the Hindu devas, good angels, and combines early Dravidian architecture in a galleried temple with basic Khmer temple architecture in the Temple Mountain. In Sanskrit and Pali, the name Angkor Wat means capital temple. It was unknown of to modern Western sentiment until a Portuguese monk named Antonio de Linea visited it around 524 years ago. The central quincunx of 5 towers is surrounded by a vast, square courtyard, enclosed by an outer wall 3.6 kilometers long per side, surrounded again, in turn, by a wide moat of shallow water 190 meters wide. The main entrance of the temple faces due west, and the central shrine's spire rises 65 meters above ground level. Every wall, almost 1,000 square meters, is richly carved and has bas-relief friezes depicting scenes from the Hindu epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. The most notable occurs on the eastern gallery walls as the scene of 92 asuras, evil angels, and 88 devas, using the serpent Vasuki to churn the sea of milk under Vishnu's direction. Angkor Wat was constructed of over 5 million tons of sandstone, quarried from Mount Kulin, 40 kilometers to the northeast. If it was begun and completed under the reign of its commissioner, it would have taken only 40 years to complete. The sacred city of Caral Supe in Supe, Barranca Province, Peru, some 200 kilometers north of Lima, is the oldest known city in the Americas and home of the Norte Chico civilization. Its over 60 hectares housed over 3,000 inhabitants between 4,600 and 4,000 years ago. Here, an urban complex spread over 150 acres, containing plazas and residences around one main pyramid, Spanish Pyramid Mayor, standing 18 meters tall and covering around 1,000 meters of area. There are at least 19 other pyramid complexes in the Caral Valley allowing for a possible population there of over 20,000 residents. Considering carbon dating of reed-woven shikra carrying bags found on site as around 4,627 years ago, the Norte Chico culture was pre-Incan and had a strong influence on later Incan culture. But the settlement by the Norte Chico at Corral in Supa Valley dates back much earlier, to around 11,210 to 10,000 years ago. The Norte Chico's culture is mostly now unknown. However, there have been found woven textile ropes, so-called quipu, or talking knots, used for mathematical record-keeping, suggesting their contemporary development of proto-writing systems. The Mesopotamians, contemporary to the early dynastic period in Egypt, were constructing pyramids of their own as well. Their model of architecture was called the ziggurat, or plateau building, and these were erected throughout the ancient Levant, most notably in the earliest development of Iraq and Iran. The Sialk ziggurat in Kashan, Iran, is the oldest known ziggurat, dating from 5,000 years ago. However, the White Temple in Uruk, ancient Sumer, is a standard example of their architecture, while the best preserved ziggurat remains in Chogazanbil in western Iran. The most well-known ziggurat is undoubtedly the Marduk ziggurat, or Etemenananki of ancient Babylon, the so-called Tower of Babel. According to Herodotus, atop each ziggurat was a shrine, and surrounding each ziggurat's base was a temple complex with courtyard, storage rooms, bathrooms, residences, etc., behind a city wall. This format formed the basis for most architectural city planning ever since, and was mimicked most often by the castle builders of feudal Europe. It is currently thought this style of architecture originated to escape the seasonal flooding of this region from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. 2A, 3B. Cultures: religious, political, economic beliefs. So what do these cultures have in common, and what distinguishes them apart? They have in common, obviously, that they all build vast, megalithic temple complexes to house the royal living and to enshrine the royal dead. And they shared in common the architectural method of raising the roofs of these structures as high as possible above the surrounding environmental terrain. While in the West, many of these later cultures turned to bloodletting and human sacrificial ritual centers. In the Orient, they were associated with libraries of scholastic monks. In all of them, the role of life and death was meditated upon heavily by their residents, many of whom went on to shape the worldly political events of their eras. 2A4. Elsewhere. Underwater. When we add the number sum of ancient megalithic city sites currently beneath the tide marks of modern shorelines, we can begin to understand where the implied need for building their architectural projects upward as stairways to the sky originates. The very real threat, at any time, in the 6 sites where civilization is said to have formed independently, of flooding from their local river systems, proved too daunting for some of the earliest civilizations, who would eventually move more inland and away from the coasts, taking their knowledge of a pyramid-building culture with them and improving on their designs along the way. Let us examine, again, only a few of these such sites that we know of now, although we should realize that, underwater even more so than above ground, there will be many sites that will remain undiscovered even long after our time here is up. 2A 1A Yonaguni, Japan, Cuba, Crete, Bimini, etc. Off the coast of Yonaguni, the westernmost of the Yaeyama Islands of Japan, there lies a sunken city of monumental proportions, consisting of a monument of very fine sandstones and mudstones of the lower Miocene Yaeyama group, believed to have been deposited there 20 million years ago. The main monument itself is a rectangular formation measuring around 150 by 40 meters and being around 27 meters tall, the top being only about 5 meters below the surface of the East China Sea and Pacific Ocean waters. There is a similar formation of contested date of origin in the Gulf of Combat, also called Cambay Gulf, the Arabian Sea inlet along the west coast of the Indian subcontinent in the oriental state of Gujarat. Off the westernmost Juana Habibis Peninsula in the Pinar del Rio province of Cuba Island is a sunken city between the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. For over 2 square kilometers, a massive urban complex ruins remains at between depths of 600 and 750 meters underwater. For the land, it appears to have been built upon, to have been uncovered by water. The date proposed by archaeologists and geologists is in excess of 50,000 years before now, putting it well before the end of the last North Hemisphere Ice Age, when there were still glaciers covering much of North America. Oloas, or Olas, in Ilondo, Crete, in the southernmost Greek islands of the Mediterranean Sea, is an authentically recognized historic sunken city, with underwater ruins such as scattered wall bases in Ilondo Bay. However, the date of its sinking and cause are now unknown. It is said to have been the hometown of Daedalus, the father of Icarus, and Iapix, an uncle of Perdix. Daedalus features prominently in the stories from Ovid's Metamorphoses 8 183 to 235, of Ariadne's labyrinth on Minoan Crete, and of Icarus' wax-winged flight toward the sun, and appears on an Etruscan jug from around 1,470 years ago. The primary temple of Olus, erected by Daedalus, was to the goddess Britomartis, meaning virgin, the Minoan goddess, equivalent to Artemis. She was depicted in a wooden statue there, holding the double axes of authority and grasping divine snakes. Her effigy adorned the coins of this now lost culture that also bore forth scrolls claiming to have done trade between the cities of Gnosis and the island of Rhodes. Off the northwest coast of North Bimini Island, 5.5 meters below modern sea level, is a formation of 3 linear features, the longest of which, called the Bimini Road or Wall, is 0.8 kilometers long, extending along northeast-southwest from the beach. But the other 2 features also extend above the water and reveal hundreds, if not thousands, of limestone beach rock, carbonate cemented shell hash blocks between 1 to 4 meters of horizontal breadth. Radiocarbon dating infers that the bricks were comprised 2,800 years ago from sediment that had previously formed around 1,300 years before then. According to ancient records from China, the fleet of Admiral Zheng attempted to circumnavigate the globe and was caught in a hurricane that sank half of them under Admiral Zhu Wen at Bimini. They had built the wall as a slipway to haul damaged junks ashore for refitting some 579 years ago. 2A, 4A. Cultures: religious, political, economic beliefs. All we can say definitively about the cultures of Yonaguni, Japan, of Guanahabibis, Cuba, of Olus, Crete, and of Bimini Island near the Bermuda Triangle is that if these submerged ruins are from ancient civilizations, all records of their existence, and they themselves, have been lost. In order to properly connect the sunken cities of Olus, Crete, to the erection of the Khufu Pyramid in the Gizeh necropolis, we would have to connect the pharaoh Unas with Greek demi-deity Daedalus, and then find causes to justify our making this connection, evidenced in some ancient artifact. Daedalus is more easily connected to Imhotep, or Hammon, the pharaoh's vizier, as a psychopomp, or escort of the dead across the river Styx. Symbolic of the transmigration of the soul after death, along the hub's rim of the Milky Way galaxy. Like the Orisha Elegua, Greek Hermes, or Egyptian Thoth Tehete, Daedalus was a messenger and a father of Cretan arts and sciences. Thus, we can speculate the original designer of pyramids in Egypt could have come from, or at the least have known of, the sunken city of Olus off Crete. However, for now, it remains just that, speculation and hypothesis, and we have nothing concrete to back up any such assertion yet. 3. Alignments. The simple and straightforward fact is that not only are all the pyramids aligned to all the others on the continent around them, but they are also aligned to one another across the vast expanses of oceans as well. Most of the pyramid building cultures we have examined inhabited a thin latitude and established coastal or river-centric cultures in the 6 places civilization independently formed during the Bronze Age: in India, the Near East, Europe, China, Africa, and the Americas during the so-called Old World or Axial Age from 2,800 to 2,200 years ago. These gave way to the classical period of Hellenism in Greece and Rome, the Persian Empire, and Second Temple Judaism in the Middle East, the Empire of India and China under the Qin and Han dynasties, in conflict with various tribal nomads, such as the Huns, the Xiongnu, and the Koch Turk Empire. During the modern minimum of the sunspot cycle, Europe experienced a mini ice age, and its economic living conditions plummeted to form what has since been called the feudal Dark Ages. However, this was contemporary to the Islamic Golden Age of Caliphates prior to the Ottoman Empire, as well as a time of many new feudal city-states based empires across Asia, Southeast Asia, Mesoamerica, the Andes Mountains, South America, and Africa. Now we live in the modern era, identified by the Western world of Europe, the Americas, Eastern Orthodox Church countries, Greece, Russia, Southeast Europe, Ukraine, Belarus, etc., Australia and Israel versus the Islamic world of the Arab Middle East, Turkey, South Africa, and Somalia, the Eastern world, or Far East, comprised of South and East Asia, the Sinosphere of Chinese influence, and Sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa, still populated by indigenous tribes. During these last 6,000 years or so, we have gone through no fewer than 3 solar aeons of around 2,000 years apiece. This means the entire skyline has been changed, and, concordantly, all the religious iconography of our species associated to it has had to be changed along with it. 100 years ago, the magician and self-proclaimed Ipsissimus, head chief of all then existent secret societies, Aleister Crowley, working from a deciphering of an ancient Egyptian stele of the demi-deity Horpakrat, whom he believed cognate to Greek Harpocrates, established the continuity thus far of 3 aeons. The first of the Mother, the second of God the Father, and the third of the crowned and conquering child who he identified with Isis, Osiris, and with Horus Ra, respectively. Prior to this beginning of our now known civilization, from before 6,000 years ago to at least around 50,000 years ago, when we originated in Africa and reached behavioral modernity as a species, having achieved anatomical modernity some 150,000 years prior to even then. There is a blank space in our historical records as a species. Supposedly, our genetic ancestors were the proto-hominid species Homo ergaster erectus, from the early Pleistocene, between 1.8 million and 1.3 million years ago, oldest of the African hominid species, and Homo heidelbergensis, from 600,000 to 400,000 years ago, considered to be the Adam and Eve to both our species, Asian Homo sapiens, and our European genetic cousin branch from 33,000 years ago that subsequently went extinct around 24,000 years ago, Homo neanderthalensis. Interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals took place from 80,000 to 50,000 years ago, and Neanderthals contribute as much as 4% of our total DNA genome to the entire population of our species today. Many ancient scholars postulated on the problem of human civilization seeming to have developed spontaneously during the Bronze Age, independently, across 6 of the 7 total global continents, all except glaciated South Polar Antarctica, and yet all had the same basic working knowledge of craft and tools to design and build with. They coined the phrase, "Our modern civilization arose suddenly, as if fully formed." Why, otherwise, would a species, dormant for 200,000 years, suddenly begin to spontaneously develop similar cultures at various independent geographic locations? And how can we account for the seemingly missing eons between the date of our species' origins, some 200,000 years ago, and when the first civilizations began in Jericho and Göbekli Tepe, some 8,000 to 10,000 years ago at the most? How did the various cultures of the Axial Age world know how to build pyramids, and why did they all align them, north, south, east, west, according to this Giza equator of alignments that connected them all along a single line? And what does it mean that they all align, even Angkor Wat built much later, to the last position of the North Geographic Pole's location, from 80,000 to 48,000 years ago, and not to its present site? 3A of the pyramids, 2 constellations. Over the last 200 million years, the axial tilt of Earth's geographic poles has traveled some 30 degrees. This means the North Pole and the South Pole have occupied multiple locations. Between 810 and 790 million years ago, during the epoch of the supercontinent called Rodinia, true polar wander events might have occurred twice, shifting the Earth's magnetic poles by around 55 degrees. The Cyrillic etymology of this supercontinent's name means the motherland, and it formed from 1.1 billion years ago from the previous supercontinent Columbia, formed from global-scale collision events 2.1 to 1.8 billion years ago to 750 million years ago, when it broke apart during the Neoproterozoic and reassembled to form Pangaea some 300 to 250 million years ago, that once covered the entire landmass of planet Earth. The true polar wander that broke up Rodinia and formed Pangaea should not be confused with geomagnetic polarity reversal events that have happened 5 times over 1 million years, around 72 million years ago, 10 times over 4 million years, some 54 million years ago, 13 times over 3 million years, 24 million years ago, 51 times in a 12 million year period centering on 15 million years ago, and twice over the last 500,000 years. During a geomagnetic pole reversal, there are multiple locations of various equally strong north and south magnetic poles. Unlike solar plasma magnetic polar reversal events, which occur as sunspot cycle peaks every 9 to 12 years, the geomagnetic polar reversals known to have occurred on Earth have happened during periods of low intensity for Earth's EM field strength. What does all this have to do with pyramid mapping? The ancients reckoned the size of the Earth in cubits, a measure devised for measuring the length of an average person's forearm, from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger, as such being about 7 palms, 4 finger widths each, and using cubit rods of about 52.5 centimeters. However, even prior to this, there was a method for measuring that was far more exact, called the megalithic yard, which was given as about 0.83 meters, and a megalithic rod of about 2.5 megalithic yards. Each megalithic rod could be divided by 100, and megalithic yard divided by 40, called a megalithic inch of 2.073 centimeters. The megalithic yard, once called the Greek fathom, of 2.072 meters, was equal to the diagonal of a rectangle, measuring 2 by 1 Egyptian remens of 5 palms, or 20 finger widths. The size of the Earth, calculated by these measures, will yield various different number sums, but the ratios for angles between these various different number sums will always stay the same, even when translating between the various number-based systems. For example, 1/2 of 180 is 90, of 90 is 45, etc., and 1/2 of 72 is 36, etc., while 3/5 of 360 is 216, 1/3 of 216 is 72, and 1/3 of 36 is 12, etc. Although the sums may differ, the ratios themselves are the same between them. The mean radius of Earth is 6,371 kilometers. It's exactly 6,378.1 kilometers from the core to the current equator, and exactly 6,356.8 kilometers from the core to the pole. Its circumference is 40,075.017 kilometers equatorial, 40,007.86 kilometers meridional, with an axial tilt of 23 degrees, 26 minutes, 21.4119 seconds, orbiting the Sun at an average velocity of 29.78 kilometers per second, or about 107,200 kilometers per hour. In cubits, these measures differ, and in the megalithic yard, or Greek fathom, they differ yet a third time. But the ratios remain the same, and therein lies the lesson. 3A1. Giza alignment is upside down, north-south, to Orion. It can be found that, along the latitudinal Giza equator, a great arc may be drawn from Angkor Wat to Teotihuacan, with Giza at its center. The ratio of this great arc's completion around the rest of the globe, between Teotihuacan in Mexico and Angkor Wat in Cambodia, is the same distance as between Teotihuacan and Giza, or between Giza and Angkor Wat. Along the Giza equator, these three monuments are about equidistant from one another, forming a triangle of ruins along a forgotten equator from when Earth's geographic polar location was offset from its present location, from 17,000 to some 12,000 years ago or so. However, this is only the figurative tip of the iceberg in these matters, as the Temple of Angkor Wat is, alike Incan Machu Picchu in the Andes Mountains of Peru, aligned to the constellation the Pleiades, the seven sister stars, while Teotihuacan and Giza are both aligned to the constellation of Orion's belt stars, the Three Kings. Their alignment is exact and precise, both within their own confines, to their own cultures, as well as in alignment with one another across the aeonic spans of time. However, they are not aligned to the stars exactly as they appear in the heavens. The Three Kings of Orion's belt, the stars from west to east of Mintaka, Delta Orionis, a double star system, Alnilam, Epsilon Orionis, and Alnitak, Zeta Orionis, do align to the Giza necropolis's three pharaonic pyramids. However, in Egypt, the smallest of the three pyramids, the Pyramid of Menkaure, signifying the smallest double star system, Mintaka, whose alignment is slightly offset by around 10 degrees, is in the furthest westmost position, and Khufu's pyramid, the largest, symbolizing the star Alnitak, is facing eastmost of all three. This makes the arrangement of the Giza pyramids upside down and backwards, from if their appearance in the sky were to be plotted as descending directly down onto the surface of the earth. Instead, they are symmetrically mirror reflected. 3A2. Yucatan alignment is north to south along the Avenue of the Dead. The second site of the two primary pyramid complexes, known to be aligned to the three kings stars of the constellation of Orion's belt, in Teotihuacan, is also, likewise, not oriented to an exactly accurate reflection nor direct imagining of this constellation's orientation upon the Earth. As mentioned, it is inclined at an angle of about 15.5 degrees from modern true geographic north-south, east-west orientation. In keeping with the theory, it is aligned to a previous position of Earth's geomagnetic polar axis locations prior to 12,000 years ago. However, the Avenue of the Dead itself is aligned along a north-south axis rather than along an east-west axis, and so this places the alignments of these pyramids geographically perpendicular to the Giza necropolis, which is oriented along an east-west angle. This fact, the Teotihuacan and Giza form a right angle with one another's orientations, is often overlooked. Teotihuacan was, most likely, built about the same time that Jesus walked the earth in Galilee and Roman Judea, or about 2,500 years after the Giza pyramids of Egypt, Africa. 3B. Of the pyramids to one another. But Angkor Wat was built most recently of all, some 1,600 years ago, around the same time as Machu Picchu in Peru, sometime around 1,650 years ago, and both are aligned to the Pleiades constellation of the Seven Sister Stars. It should be obvious to map this pyramid-building culture that they have progressed from the Orient ever westward, until finally returning again to Southeast Asia. However, this assessment fails to regard the sunken cities of Japan, Crete, and Cuba. Where do they fit in? They are, within a meager margin, also in line along the same Giza equator, and form a smaller measurement within the greater triangular circumference of planet Earth formed of Giza, Teotihuacan, and Angkor Wat. This smaller measure consists of a total distance equal to the distance between any of the two locations on the global arcing Giza equator, from Cuba to Crete, to Japan, and back to Cuba, forms a second, though irregularly distanced, great triangle around the Earth along another equatorial latitude line, slightly offset from the Giza equator. These facts are incontrovertible. However, they may remain foggy in the eye of the mind's reasoning faculty, yet because the question as to why remains unaddressed. 3b1. Giza pyramids are aligned along a phi spiral, Sphinx facing east. The offsetting of alignment between the two primary pyramid structures in Giza of Khufu and Khephren, and in Teotihuacan of the pyramids of the Sun and Moon, both symbolizing the primary belt stars of the Orion constellation, Al-Natak and Al-Nalam, from the single, separate, smaller structure, the Pyramid of Menkaure in Giza, and the Temple of Quetzalcoatl in Teotihuacan, both symbolizing the dual star Mentaka, of about 10 degrees, can also be explained differently using the Fibonacci, or 1 to 2/3, the 0.33 or 1/3 golden ratio, based phi spiral. If you compute such a phi spiral, as one might find in an average chambered nautilus mollusk shell, over the Giza Plateau's schematic layout, you arrive at an axial line connecting the center of this spiral to the southeasternmost corner of the Khufu Pyramid that crosses the location occupied by the Sphinx. The Sphinx had once been used as a ceremonial chamber, where the dressings for wrapping the mummy were prepared by the Egyptian Empire's priestcraft. 3b2. Yucatan pyramids are aligned north-south along the Way of the Dead. Like the Sphinx, the pyramids of Giza themselves are aligned along an east-west orientation relative to our present true geographic north, offset by no more than 15.5 degrees, oriented to the present magnetic poles, or perhaps to the past geographic poles. The Avenue of the Dead at Teotihuacan in Mexico is oriented in a more or less north-south direction. Thus, as I have pointed out, the Giza necropolis and Teotihuacan's Avenue of the Dead may be thought of as, figuratively, forming a right angle to one another. The reasons for this remain unclear. However, this fact itself cannot be excluded from discussions now tendered. 3b3. Global alignments of all sites relative to the Giza equator. Think of these three sites along the Giza equator as alike or equivalent to the 3 seasons of the Egyptian Sothic calendar. Inundation season, called Akhet, consisted of 4 months of 30 days each month of 3 weeks of 10 days each. Emergence season, called Peret, was likewise equivalent and divided. Harvest season, called Shemu, was comprised of the last 120 days of the Sothic year, and the difference between the Sothic year of 360 days and the Renpet, or mean year, of 365 days, was taken up by 4 seasonal and 1 annual holiday between one Shemu harvest and the next Akhet inundation. These were considered the 5 Heru-Renpet in Egypt, and were very akin to the 5 Zama-Kaba-Kin of the Mixtec calendar, used in the Mesoamerican Yucatan. Just as the Cuba, Japan, Crete, equatorial latitude arc might have once been aligned to an even more ancient polar position, so too is the Giza equator aligned to the location of the geographic poles from 17,000 to 12,000 years ago. Now we must pause and ask why. For modern theories. There is no shortage in supply of modern theories about who built the pyramids and why. However, among the cacophony of competing independent researchers, there are common threads that interconnect many of their stories. We will be examining all these common threads, both the mainstream and fringe of this fabric. It is important in doing so to remember that many modern Mayanologists are shams now, as much as were certain French Egyptianists, as opposed to Egyptologists, following the return of Napoleon's army from the Battle of the Pyramids, mentioned here in the introduction. These quack and sham, or bogus and phony scientists, pass off pseudoscience as their research in a field they have little more experience with than their own drug-induced delusions, claiming to be modern shaman in direct descent to 7 secret chiefs. They fly into trances and channel spiritism, alike in a seance, in the meditation room of the United Nations headquarters building in downtown Manhattan, New York, New York. So, to conduct a thorough examination, let us deal with both the most likely theories, as well as those less likely, but more popularly known, both collectively. 4a. Theories for their design. Modern Egyptological academia purports that pyramids served as complex tombs, and seem to discount their role in mass ritual magic ceremonies dealing with the entombed pharaoh's transmigration into an afterlife as only a soul without a body. However, either way, as meant to be permanent tombs or as merely temporary ceremonial centers for preparing the corpse to be entombed elsewhere, the Egyptian pyramids of Giza served a purpose that revolved around mankind's morbid philosophical fixation with his own mortality. To a purist, it might seem like mixing the sacred with the profane, to combine ritual death ceremonies with architecture symbolizing their most high concepts of holy ideals. However, from the point of view of the ritualists themselves, such would make more intuitive sense in the context of the metempsychosis passion play being acted out by the priestcraft as they inter the mummy. The soul, called in Egyptian the Ba, meaning energy double, or duplicate, was believed to escape via the air shafts cut as passageways at odd angles through the sheer limestone. The alignments of these air shafts in the king's chamber room of the Khufu Pyramid of Giza are well documented as aligning with certain stars at only certain times. For example, the air shafts from the eastern wall of the king's chamber align to Al-Natak and to Sirius, respectively, but only 4,350 years ago. Now they do not. Again, this is due to precession, and the gradual slipping of the Earth's apparent position in its orbit relative to the celestial globe surrounding us in the sky. 4A1. Preserving sacred ratios. Obviously of utmost importance to them, even more important in their design and construction than the ritual ceremonies acted out using them. The role of preserving sacred ratios played a primary part in the function of the erection of these enormous megalithic structures. The role of measuring stellar alignments, astroarchaeology, played by the henges and mynheers of Europe and North Asia, cannot be disputed, and likewise, neither can the more advanced alignments of the complex, the Sphinx statue, and the air shafts within the Great Pyramid of Giza. If Stonehenge in England is meant as a calendar, then Giza in Egypt is meant as a library to store the same format of data. The ratios seemingly most important in the layout and design of the pyramids are those of phi, the Fibonacci or golden mean ratio of 1 to 2/3, and pi, anciently reckoned as 22/7. Pi is used in the proportions of the standing structures individually, and phi is used in their arrangement relative to one another. Hence, phi and pi are the most important ratios contained within the memory of the pyramid's stones. Other ratios included, however, should be considered no less integral, particularly those revolving around whole numbers, such as the pyramid's measurements in Egyptian royal cubits. 4A2. Use in death-based rituals. We can, forsaking all but the most basic education on the subject matter, still assert that the pyramids were originally erected for funerary purposes, and that they are symbols of death. Much like the crucifix for Christians, the pyramids were a symbol to the ancient mind of its own mortal end. The abyss of Nuit, the night sky goddess of Egypt, posed the challenge of necessarily dying from one's body to cross the river Styx and enter the underworld gallery of other souls. This theory holds additional weight, considering the alignments of the air shafts being timed to align with the stars Alnitak and Sirius exactly 4,350 years ago, forming a temporary window when alignments occur and later reoccur. That it may have been used as such, I have no doubts. However, the questions remain: if so, how and why? Obviously, the grand gallery connecting the king's chamber to the central core queen's chamber could be thought of to symbolize the Amduat, the Egyptian equivalent of the Milky Way, based Greek river Styx. But whose idea was this originally? Was it intentional on the part of the initial concept's designer, or did it grow and adapt later as the architectural pyramid building culture grew, changed, and spread? To these questions, a merely basic education on the subject can shed no light, and so, to delve deeper, we must learn more. 4A3. Further speculations. To dispense with the origin myth of the first step pyramid for King Djoser, built at Saqqara, near Thebes in northwestern Egypt, along the river Nile, and designed by the king's vizier, Imhotep. We can posit that Imhotep was a like Thoth, living in or around the same time as did Pharaoh Unas, Queen Assisi, and Prince King Teti, who comprised the founding characters of the Ennead of Heliopolis, along with Set Typhon. In the Ennead, the god Atum was the name of the chief deity, but this was later changed, first to Monthu in the Middle Kingdom, and later to Amen or Amun by the New Kingdom. Around 3,336 to 3,334 years ago, Amenhotep IV, meaning Amen is satisfied, changed his regnal nomenclature to Akhenaten and instituted solar monotheism, transporting the Egyptian capital city from the temple at Karnak in Thebes to the far southern city Amarna, and replacing Amun again with Aten, the solar disk of the sun god Ra. Had the democratization of the afterlife of the second intermediate period between the Middle and New Kingdoms, some 3,650 to 3,550 years ago, been avoided, the Ennead of Heliopolis of the Old Kingdom would not have allowed in Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Set, and would have remained comprised of only Atum, the self-created Ben-Ben-seated, above Nu, the combined waters, Shu, god of wind or air, and Tefnut, goddess of salt waters, and the grandchildren of Atum, Geb, serpent-headed god over the soil's fertility, and Nuit, the night sky or cosmos goddess. Over time, as Atum became renamed Monthu, then Amun, and finally Aten Ra, his concept became more associated with the attributes of the sun itself, and so he was sometimes affiliated also with the deity Khepri as the eastern rising sun, coupled with Atum as the western setting sun. Khepri Atum was thus a prototype from Egypt of the later Coptic Gnostic concept of Lucifer, named Shaher Shalem, meaning hello goodbye, and recited about as such by Jesus quoting Isaiah, comparing the morning star, the planet Venus is commonly associated to this concept, to a fiery serpent or seraph, comet, that falls from the sky as a meteorite. Thus, there is the democratization of the afterlife that allowed into the Heliopolis cult of Atum, the new generation of gods, based on living pharaohs of the 4th and 5th dynasty, that ultimately resulted in confusing the cult of the Ennead at Heliopolis with the concept of monotheism under Atum Ra. 4a, 3a. Balancing the Earth's crust on pivot points. One possible theory regarding the alignment of these massive piles of debris is their weight and density affect the gravitational stability of the planet itself. Although this seems unlikely, it has been posited as a theory and should not be discounted as possibly among the toolkit of persuasion used to pitch this concept by Vizier Hammon to Pharaoh Khufu, who knows the dreams of a wizard when tempted by the promise of unlimited funding for such a massive public works program. However, there is little real validity to this claim besides the so-called esoteric energies photographed around glass, pyramid-shaped models using Cryllian aura photography. Supposedly, this type of photograph captures one's electromagnetic field and amplifies it photoscopically, such that it can be not only viewed in colors dependent on mood, but seen to take the form of a field of arcing sparks surrounding all living tissue, both animal and plant cells alike. Even metals, to some lesser extent, exert some capacitance or resistance to this etheric current, and can be seen to mimic this auric glow of the living when electrified with direct current. In the case of glass pyramids serving as containers for various items, and then aura photographed using Cryllian photography, there appear uncannily regularized logarithmic spirals emanating upward from the pyramid's top. This modernly so-called pyramid power is well catalogued, but not at all understood. Couple this with Cryllian photographs showing the extreme electromagnetic amplification of small rocks and pebbles recovered from the Giza Plateau necropolis complex, and the result is New Age hysteria about alien technologies being harnessed in the designs of this simple half-octahedron shape. Understanding the concept of pivot points as necessary for the moving of the extremely large and heavy limestone cubes that comprise the pyramids into place, it could have been an early intention to position monuments at certain places around the globe as an artificial gyroscopic stabilization device. This does not mean to lend credence to this being definitely the case, however, either. 4A3B. Harnessing Earth's EM field like antennae. There is too much web buzz these days about ionospheric heating devices, with too little awareness among the general public about how they work, and thus why they should not be used. The Eastland patents, ostensibly authorizing the militarization of such projects, were merely following in Tesla's wake, and foresaw an opportunity that was then exploited by the nefarious black budget shadow government, the military, banking, Intel media complex. The premise of Tesla tech can be dangerous for amateur engineers, but no less so than the precautions taken regarding direct current by Edison. The premise of the Eastland patents was to use a global grid of ionospheric heating antenna arrays and establish an ionospheric shield around Earth. This process has begun in the form of the signals sent and relayed back to HAARP in Alaska. However, if erect metal antennae are ionospheric heaters, could the stone megaliths in turn act as ionospheric coolers? Are these inventions truly part of the same global climate control system established by the ancients and maintained by the United States Army's Department of Defense, the USA DoD. This goes to the ancient aliens concept of fringe and pseudo-science, but we cannot discard it as being popular simply because it is not exactly accurately factual truth. There remains the possibility that there are forces at work now behind the scenes of our daily existence that we remain unaware of for a very good reason. 4A 3C. Syncing of alignment windows for optimal warping. One such circumstance presents itself in the argument of space travel versus time travel. Many argue time travel as stationary and space travel as motive through the void outside Earth's atmosphere. Thus, a time tunnel in one location in space can connect to the same location in space at an earlier time. This is about the essence of all time travel modern researchers delve into, because beyond this paradoxes abound. Of course, we find these arising in the natural universe constantly regardless, and being cancelled out in rapid succession, as paradoxes are, indeed, self-correlating, self-regulating, and ultimately self-terminating. However, beyond the theories, there remains some hope for a glimmer of fact. If space and time are indeed relative, there arises at least the probability that what we look out and see in the void of space beyond Earth's atmosphere are simply other parallel versions of our own planetary solar system, merely appearing abandoned due to a distortion on the perceptual sense of time. If we see a planet that is 100 million light years away, and see on photons arriving to our location now that it is uninhabited, but that it could one day foreseeably support life, it is likely enough that, during the 100 million years it took that light we see the planet by to travel to us from it, the planet at its actual location, in present space-time, has evolved into a much different form than we are seeing it now. And it might even have already developed sentient life that is, in turn, looking back at us. If the ancients reasoned at all like this, they could have easily used such thinking to forward the project of pyramid building. The alignments of the air shafts from the king's chamber to the stars Alnitak and Sirius, corresponding to around the professed date of the pyramid's foundations, further seems to indicate such thought processes were not alien to the pharaohs and viziers of the ancient Egyptian empire. 4b. Most likely theories for their construction. Having dispensed with two simple truths, their construction according to sacred ratios, and their use in funerary rites, and two complex theories, their use in stabilizing Earth's rotational velocity and pitch, and in stabilizing its climatological atmosphere. Let us set the ancient aliens theory aside for a moment and examine the evidence at hand with the intent to ask if it could have been done by humans on Earth without alien interference or help. The most likely scenarios for the construction of the pyramid complexes throughout the ancient and modern eras are fairly commonplace engineering tricks, however remain unknown and mysterious to non-engineers. For example, simply dropping a plumb line to establish gravitational vertical and perpendicular thereto is a long moralized over secret of the secret society of free and accepted masonry. The tools of the mason's craft comprise the moral working tools in speculative craft masonry, and each tool for architecturally cutting, hewing, and rendering stone is assigned a moral meaning. At the time of the building of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, Israel, for example, around the lifetime of Jesus and the turn of the last solar aeon prior to now, the secret society we call today F and AM were called then the Nazareans, and were the working sect of the Essenes, who were trained to the level of medical doctors. The group of masons working on the Great Pyramid of Khufu, no less so than those first masons who constructed the first temple on Mount Zion under King Solomon, would have had these working tools of their craft, and they would have possessed mastery over them, the likes of which cannot be duplicated by raw talent and luck. Raising such a class of, as postulated, for the size of the workforce on the Khufu Pyramid and the then incomplete Giza necropolis, 20,000 craftsmen, artisans, and masons often takes a generation of pre-planning prior to such a project, just to inculcate a population with the basic nationalist patriotism necessary to undertake a monumental building project. This might lend evidence to the concept of Egyptian masonry being of a more speculatively advanced nature than even the modern form of F and AM is aware today. 4B1. Concentrated steam used to hew stone. Brown's gas, HHO called such, is fakery and does deserve to be taken as pseudoscience. However, H2O, in the form of superheated condensed water vapor, steam, does deserve to be taken very seriously. Steam, superheated and run through a compression nozzle, can render raw limestone as malleable as soft concrete putty. Under the proper conditions, it can sever stones to within a micron of measurement with its cutting precision. Or, under others, it can melt to slag and then allow to recool into place, molten metal poured in between the limestone casing stones to secure it to its neighbor as a joiner, a hooked latch between them. Steam, if used correctly, can weld stone better than electric arc welders metal, and can, if harnessed in large enough amounts, power turbine electrical conversion engines. The use of steam would not have been alien either to masons at the time of the construction work on the Khufu Pyramid at the Giza necropolis, for both quarrying, hewing, and exact placement of more or less mortarless stone masonry, such as the pyramids are. Perhaps the best example of using simple steam, compressed at high pressure, to weld stone is in Machu Picchu, the Incan citadel in the Andes of Peru, where the stones, some of more than 10 tons, appear mortarless, joined and fitted together almost like puzzle pieces. Here we can definitively see the application of steam to weather the stones into place. Local legends recall that Machu Picchu was built by melting stones like water. The method of fitting bricks together without mortar is called ashlar. It was practiced heavily on the island of Crete, at Phaistos, and Knossos around 3,700 to 3,650 years ago. Its practice, along with pyramid building in general, might relate to the paranoia of early builders over natural disasters such as the so-called Great Deluge or World Flood. 4b2. Pivot blocks and wedges, pulleys to transport. One man can rotate a 1-ton ashlar limestone cube with one hand using a pivot point beneath the stone's exact center of gravity. Although winches, pulleys, fulcrums, levers, rolling logs as dollies, etc. are sometimes considered modern technology by scientists, it seems counterintuitive to me to believe the Egyptians that raised the Khufu pyramid were ignorant of the full technological potentials of such rudimentary implements of civil engineering. Not to mention the harnessing of wild beasts, such as elephants, who were much more plentiful in the region at that time than now, could account for some additional torque in towing power if necessary. The only problem with knowing such engineering trickery is being tempted to use it for its own sake, just to show off, as with those who use the stock stomper to render crop circles as art for its own sake. When architecture ceases being utilitarian, it ceases to be a humanism and becomes an imposition onto consciousness, a burden, a distraction, a nightmare. Such was as Socrates saw in Athenian proto-nationalist sculpture movements of his era, and he stated it as such. Modern Athenian art is thrice removed from the kingdom, where by kingdom he referred to the realm of pure ideals. 4b3. Exact placement by smelting metal joiners. At locations from Pumapunku in the Tiwanaku, Bolivia, Incan ruins, to the Roman ruins of Baalbek in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, there remains evidence of the use of metal eye-shaped flat beam joiners to connect the hewn ashlars together more stably and serve as a form of connective mortar. The open secret of the use of I-beam joiners becomes more transparent and less opaque when we realize these metals were forged to molten and deposited between the stones to fill into their gaps and, once cooled, simply solidify into the I-beams inside the pre-cut molds and thus to smelt stone. Although the ashlar methods are nakedly obvious from the ruins, the method itself remains more or less an open secret of modern masonry. In short, there is no shortage in supply of speculations. 5. Unanswered questions. Now, even knowing that steam, fulcrums, and elephants all could have additionally been employed in the construction process, and knowing that the designs were rudimentarily meant as a library of sacred ratios preserved in stone by a death-worshipping priest class, and speculating, moreover, that there could be further uses for the pyramids intended by their original designers than we now know, there yet remain many unanswered questions still to sort through. Some of these include: the specific size of a workforce needed to quarry, hew, transport, and affix into place the 2,500,000 limestone cubes of which the Great Pyramid of Khufu is formed, the original intentions of the designers versus the ultimate political outcomes to result from their contributions. The question of the catacombs and supposed cave complex beneath the Giza Plateau, and of course the question of what myths, both ancient and modern, have to say about how the Khufu Pyramid was built and why. Allow me to address each of these in the following manner. 5a. Size of workforce necessary. The numbers, given or implied, in Herodotus are around 20,000 men working for around 20 years. This is, of course, prima facie impossible. The workforce would diminish gradually and inevitably need to be replenished. There would be no incentive for new workers if their last employees died on the job, and morale would diminish, making the job last longer or even never end at all. Eventually, workers would revolt, form labor unions, and demand higher wages as the project approached apparent completion. If their demands could not be met, the project could not be finished. However, the pyramids were finished, all of them, and splendidly. We have not one story of a Spartacus character leading these supposed slave laborers to their liberty. We have not one tall tale of a Frederick Douglass type who became emancipated and rallied against the institution of pyramid craftsmanship for its inhumane work ethics. We have not one Benedict Arnold nor Judas on the whole project's history. Although such is not the case in the myths of the builders themselves, who recall Enoch being murdered by Tubal Cain with Jabal and Jubal, who recall Hiram Abiff being murdered by Menelik, Jubello, Jubella, and Jubellum, and who recall the fated assassination of Julius Caesar for crossing the Rubicon and stationing his troops within Rome, setting into motion the events that would result in his being laureled as imperator for life. The mistake of those who would be builders has always been to lower their guard at a crucial moment, only to be betrayed by their apparent colleagues, peers, and friends. However, what of Imhotep, or Vizier Hammon, his successor? Was the prototype of the god Thoth murdered while constructing the Pyramid of Osiris? This may explain the lack of any mummified remains to be found of Imhotep thus far. However, those of Akhenaten remain at large as well, which only raises more questions about the events during his life, contemporary to the exodus of Moses. 5b. Original intentions versus ultimate uses. If we cannot know the composition of the workforce, we should at least try to figure out the original intentions for the device and put it to its ultimate use, or see it dismantled according to the original inventor of the concept. In this case, again, we return to the connection between Daedalus, Hermes, Thoth, and Imhotep. Beyond vague traces and connections made between these in mythologies, Of the ancient world, we know nothing in reality about the person who invented the pyramid. If, as Daedalus, or as Ziusudra, or as Utnapishtim, one man were to have escaped the sinking of the city of Olus off the Isle of Crete, he could have made his way via to Egypt and established himself there as vizier to a king. His strong opinions on fortifications of ashlar architecture against natural disasters would not fall on deaf ears with any king sensitive to the needs of their citizens' economy. 5c. Are reasons given in mythology trustworthy? Can you judge a book by its cover? Can you be trusted with a book to judge it? How far can you trust any author? How far can you really trust yourself? These sort of questions might even unnerve the average Western civilized intellect, because they are the sort we do not often ask ourselves, unlike our brethren in the ancient Egyptian Empire, who dwelt upon the topic of their own demise daily in the form of their work on the Gizeh necropolis. If you prefer to believe in popular fables rather than simple scientific facts, it is your choice to make, and I will not censor your options in this regard. As I have explained already, the most likely scenarios surrounding the pyramid's original intentions and methods of construction, so far as I am now aware. I will next provide you with some of the more well-known, but less likely events to explain how the pyramids occur. 5c. 1. The accounts in modern popular myths. To subscribe to an old religion seems foolish at best, and to subscribe to a new one, even exponentially so. So let us dispense with the pleasantries of religiosity and its banter, and having chewed away the fodder, dig into the meat of this philosophical debate now. Many are alive now who have their own beliefs, and that's fine. It's okay to believe differently than anyone and everyone else. It's okay to be unique. But the problem comes when people evangelize and preach this belief, or any belief, with such fervor and gusto that it demotivates the resistance of their victim, eventually causing cults to form and to gradually approach metastasis moment when they spontaneously flourish and blossom into a new major world religion. One can no more renounce religion than one could hope to escape the wrath of an all-knowing God, because regardless of one's belief about God, one has awareness of the concept of God almost from the moment of birth. One cannot escape having some opinion on this subject, one way or another, and therein lies the difficulty. The God concept is self-destructive. It contains within it the germinating seed of the suicidal demiurge, the universal devil, Yaldabaoth, the anti-God. However, if God has even one emotion, it is contradictory to the unchanging clause of our covenant with him, which stipulates that there is one Most High, all-making, unmade, all-moving, unmoved, prima causa. How can he be both unchanging and be able to experience even one difference or change in emotion? Yet we are told God is sometimes loving kindness, a forgiving smile, and a helping hand, and at other times God is wrathful vengeance, a sword to smite, and a fist to crush his enemies. It seems very contradictory to the logical faculty mankind has been given free will to develop. And if there is no soluble answer to the question of God's existence or non-existence, and the monotheist idea is so old, how then can there be any hope of finding any logical facts at all in modern popular mythologies of new or young religious cults? 5C 1A. The account of pre-diluvial giants in Theosophy. According to H.P. Blavatsky, Helena Petrovna Dogon of Russia, France, and the U.S., the construction of the pyramids, quote, must have been over 31,000 years, 31,105 ago, end quote. The Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, Cosmogenesis, page 435. In Century Path, a magazine devoted to the brotherhood of humanity, the promulgation of Theosophy, and the study of ancient and modern ethics, philosophy, science, and art, Volume 13, Part 2, page 42, an enthusiastic review signed only Student reads, "The Great Pyramid, with its manifold astronomical hints, was almost certainly built not less than about 78,000 years ago." Following with a citation to Secret Doctrine, Volume 2, Anthropogenesis, page 47. From Century Path, Volume 12, Part 1, page 28, quote, "These gigantic monuments were set up by giants, of whose existence in prehistoric times there is ample testimony everywhere. Even many of the perched blocks and rocking stones, attributed by geologists to the work of nature, are stated by H.P. Blavatsky in The Secret Doctrine to have been set up by giants." End quote. Again, the signature allowed is only Student. Blavatsky herself was a Spiritist movement activist and held seances complete with trapdoors, props, and piped-in sound effects. Her cult of Theosophy gained the support of certain prominent Freemasons of her time, namely Charles Leadbeater, and when his wife, Annie Besant, died, her estate founded the Lucius Trust that still brokers the bills and cooks the books for the UN's Security Council to this day. That is why self-professing Theosophists are allowed to practice their trance-channeling sessions in the meditation room at UNHQ in New York, New York. Nevertheless, despite employing ghostwriters for the bulk of her published material, Blavatsky merely regurgitated the research done by others and used it to support her broad and sweeping generalizations based solely on her knowledge of ancient mythologies. 5C 1B. The account of Marduk's imprisonment by Sitchin. In the magnum opus of his decades-long career writing about the Sumerian cylinder seal translations he was working on, finally, in 1999, renowned Sumerologist and ancient alien enthusiast Zecharia Sitchin finally published his complete translation of the Sumerian cylinder seals as the Lost Book of Enki. According to Sitchin's own chronology of events, some 5,450 years ago, Marduk Ra, the patron god of Babylon, was temporarily imprisoned in the Great Pyramid of Giza, but was freed through an emergency shaft. This description of events immediately follows what Sitchin dubs the Tower of Babel incident. This dates the pyramids as having already been built at a time just following the so-called World Flood, or Great Deluge, described in the literature of the region as having occurred at around that time. Sitchin's timeline puts the deluge event as having occurred 13,000 years ago, however interpolates an additional 7,000 years of history, while the pre-Sumerian Anunnaki pantheon supposedly ran the planet Earth as their slave pool and playpen. Most biblical scholars date the event of the flood to around no sooner than 6,000 years ago. Quite simply, although it may be an authentically pre-existent basis for the stories of pre-biblical era events in the Levant region, there remain too many plot holes in the translation to accept it as 100% valid without question. Again, we are looking at a modern, popular myth, but nevertheless, it's a myth, and myths are never 100% of the truth 100% of the time. 5C 1C Modern UFO Ascended Masters Beliefs. Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, predicted that a portion of the temples may yet be discovered under the slime of ages and seawater near Bimini, expected in 68 or 69, not so far away. Prior to the discovery there, in 1968, of the now famous geoglyph of the partially submerged road or wall formation, Cayce claimed to do psychic past life regression psychology on both himself and others, and spread his concepts that Atlantis was located near the modern Bermuda Triangle, and that it was sunk in a final catastrophic event 12,000 years ago. When his prediction about Bimini proved accurate, Cayce heralded it as the rising of Atlantis. Obviously, Cayce, among the others, being in this case merely Sitchin and Blavatsky, was best aware of the calendar of the aeons and its natural ebb and flow of cause and effect on our global environment and geography. Alas, however, for even now as I write this, there is a ratio of 1 honest healer to every 10 hackneyed cranks. The last 50 years have been rampant with false prophets, pretend messiahs, and self-proclaimed second comings of such and such or so and so. The myth of the Neo-Demiurge expired on December 21, 2012. There should be no more pretenders to the throne, no further self-styled reptilians, and no one who supports the New World Order should be allowed to remain long in their offices of arbitrary social authority. 5C2 The accounts in ancient myths. It seems that earlier in our species' history, during the peak of the last North Hemisphere Ice Age, some 12,000 years ago or so, global sea levels were much lower due to the amount of global supply of H2O suspended as glaciers above North America. The result was that the underground grottos were devoid of their usual water level. In short, the aquifer dropped. This led to a resurgence at the time of cavern dwelling, and in almost all historical records, this would have marked the end of the Atlantean era, if there ever was one, and the end of the era of our species' cohabitation with our European cousins, the Neanderthals. The myths of giants and Nephilim could not be more clearly describing our era of cohabitation with the Neanderthals until the peak of the last ice age. However, if remains of ruins such as Yonaguni, the ruins off the coast of Guanahasibibes Peninsula, and the Pinar del Rio province of Cuba, the sunken city off Olos Crete, etc., proved to be genuinely ancient, pre-Ice Age era sunken man-made structures, or if they are merely naturally occurring, but rare geophysical terrestrial features, remains to be proven definitively by either camp. 5C 2A Imhotep, the architect's inscription, and the papyrus of Ani. We, in fact, know so little about Imhotep in reality. It all amounts to only this: the oldest and most often repeated etched tomb graffiti name from the pre-French Napoleon Army's survey of Cairo was Imhotep on the majority of tomb site walls. The Papyrus of Ani, or Egyptian Book of the Dead, having been written around the lifetime of Pharaoh Unas, King Djoser, and Vizier Imhotep, may only be incidental, but it bears some further scrutiny nevertheless. The Papyrus of Ani was the New Kingdom era edition of what began in the Old Kingdom as the Pyramid texts, and which, by the Middle Kingdom, was known as the Coffin texts, and is a collection of spells used in funerary rites to assist the deceased's soul with guidance through the perils of the afterlife in the underworld until their soul ascends to heaven. This cycle of literature collectively amounts to what we call today the Egyptian Book of the Dead, to distinguish it from the similar practices of other cultures, such as the Tibetan Buddhist Bardo Total, an essentially similarly themed work of literature from a very different geographic location in space and moment and historical time. 5C 2B the Mixtec, Mayan, Aztec, Cherokee, Calendar, and Pakal Votan. As the role had been for Imhotep regarding the Old to Middle Kingdom updating of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, so was the mantle in Mesoamerican Mayan culture passed down to Pakal, the ruler of the polity of Palenque in the late Classic period of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican chronology. Pakal lived some approximately 1,495 years ago in the Yucatan Peninsula and oversaw the expansion of his capital city, and it may have been around this time the famous observatory there was constructed. The lid of Pakal's sarcophagus inscription depicts him, according to some, beneath the world tree, receiving the methods of keeping time that would later become the Mayan Aztec or Mixtec and Cherokee calendars. The lid of the sarcophagus was housed, along with Pakal's interred remains, in the Temple of Inscriptions, just as Moses was by writing the first Torah. Pakal became a scribe of the heavens when he added to the pre-existing Popol Vuh stories of his era the myths of Kukulkan, or Quetzalcoatl, the Mesoamerican symbolic equivalent to the return or second coming of Jesus. Kukulkan, based on Viracocha, became the heroic nationalist symbol for all the Mesoamerican cultures that followed until the invasions of the conquistadors began. The myth of Kukulkan, also associated with the Hopi tribe's Blue Star Kachina, is that once there was a benevolent fair-skinned immigrant to South America named Viracocha. Viracocha and his people were dispersed from the region of Tiwanaku by local tribes. Some fled by sea across the Pacific to Easter Island and became the Rapa Nui culture. Others fled inland and blended in with the Incan civilization to the northeast. This culture began keeping the record of its migrations as the Popol Vuh, and over time it split into the Mayan, Aztec, Mixtec, and Cherokee cultures as well. These cultures all preserve a peculiar calendar called the Great Cycle, or Tonalamatl, dubbed by the ignorant conquistadors the Aztec Century. 5C 2C. The global preservation of independent regional flood myths. All around the world, the same event has occurred, only at different eras in history. A terrible tsunami and mega hurricane that cause an enormous, swift inundation, driving all the people for the highest ground they can find, eventually, but ultimately drowning them even there. This event we recall as though being genetically hardwired to cringe at thunder, by the terms the deluge, the world flood, etc. However, in each of the cases where we find this story, there are coastlines and islands where the tradition is preserved the most prominently. In no mainly mainland nation-state does the flood myth predominate so heavily as it does along the coastlines. This is because, at one stage in our species' evolution, between some 12,000 and some 6,000 years ago, humanity was predominantly a coastal, regional-dwelling, seafaring species. The North American Ice Age was ending, and the water levels were increasing. We might have, at this time, been forced to adapt to a more aquatic lifestyle, because the proto-cities we had begun to build had been sunken by the rising aquifer levels. We were forced out of caves, and they became more and more submerged underwater, and eventually developed a temporarily global, coastal level of civilization. However, as more ice sheets broke off from above North America, and the sea levels rose, conditions on the water became less and less navigable. Eventually, extreme flooding forced us to move inland, as well as occupying only the beach fronts. And that was when megalithic culture of pyramid building began. 5D. Deep underground, underwater caverns and catacombs. Long before the pyramids were conceived of, let alone erected, the ancient fault lines and fissures in the Earth's drier crust as it floats upon its mantle of molten magma around its molten iron core were formed as lava ducts. In some of these massive underground grottos are vast stores of unknown forms of crystal and mineral, formed only from the superheating under pressure of the indigenous formations of rock type. Many of these crystal caves were submerged below modern sea level, the so-called aquifer, and form underground rivers along these ancient, now long cooled, lava ducts. In some cases, these fault lines reheat at a later time, due to the constant pushing pressure of the shifting tectonic plates. Although most of the time, these underground rivers function without our ever knowing they are there, at least until one opens a sinkhole directly below us. This would be the exact opposite of the normal hot or cold springs that well up from deep below ground level from time to time. A sinkhole can appear due to a large cave underground collapsing its ceiling inward from its rooftop. When this occurs, a gigantic hole can simply open up in the ground, seemingly out of nowhere. 5D1 Crystal Caves and Geomagnetics. As a general rule, crystals are not magnetic. There are some minerals that are, including magnetite, and even, to some extent, amber, petrified tree sap, if exposed to static electric induction, friction. Likewise, there are such things as ferromagnetic fluids, comprised of chemical elements found in nature that could be formed in and or around large deposits of their constituent material component chemicals. The possibility for regular iron ore to become ferromagnetic is about the same as for any other common earth element, metallics, and mineral composites. Occasionally there are sufficiently magnetically sensitive metallic alloys or minerals in a rock or soil formation that it induces remnant magnetism to occur in that area, causing a stronger, localized electromagnetic field to override the weaker global electromagnetic field. The Schumann resonance frequency, formed from the combined sound of all simultaneously occurring global lightning strikes, is about 40 kilohertz, well within the range of brain entrainment pitches when audible to the human ear. Some have compared the Schumann resonance to the soul of Gaia herself, our own Mother Nature ideal. The fractures in Earth's crust correspond to the pressures applied by the tectonic plates onto one another as they drift slowly behind Earth's maximum velocity of combined rotation and orbit. Because there are 7 main continental shelves, the tectonic plates making these land masses up are the only important ones to know about, causing mountains when they collide and valleys when they depart. From throughout these fault lines and fissures can rupture forth untold wealth in gems and precious metals. 5D2 Underground Rivers and Ley Lines. The art of water dowsing is taking a wishbone-shaped stick, walking in a line, and waiting for it to bow down under its own weight as you hold it outward, watching the stick for it to make its prediction about the best location to drill a well and find an underground source of water supply. When the stick bows down, you have found water. Allegedly, the effectiveness rate of dowsing is actually incredibly low. However, the random success rate remains relatively high simply due to the preponderance of underground sources of access to deep crustal grottos inside old lava ducts along tectonic fault lines and fissures that have since been filled in by the aquifer. There are more caves underground than we know about. 5D3 Fault lines and fissures, dormant and active. Some caves occur along fault lines or fissures that are dormant, which means very little, if anything, about their geography to the people lucky enough to be living in those places. Other caves occur along fault lines or fissures that are active from time to time, and this is never a good spot to settle. Aside from electromagnetic pressure, being able to induce unconscious hallucinatory conditions themselves, and these being caused along fissures and fault lines where active tectonic crustal pressure is exerting friction, there is a certain magnetic draw in some to live in such conditions, regardless of how unsafe or insane it seems to others. Some visit as tourists and then leave, while others feel compelled to live dangerously and experience life in a constant condition of knowing that at any moment the active fissure or fault line could rupture and spew molten magma above the surface as lava, erupt in a volcano spewing a cloud of ash, and essentially drive you toward the coast by chasing you an inch at a time with a flood of flaming liquid stone. Knowing the loss of life at the Roman Empire's resort city of Pompeii, when Mount Vesuvius erupted, about 1,921 years ago, I choose to vacation in the safety of what Einstein called the mental laboratory, i.e., my mind itself. The fact people continue to live on active fissures and fault lines is as much responsible for the promulgation of the global flood myths as is its literally very real electromagnetic pull responsible for people once there to find it difficult to leave. 5D4. The death cult of the underworld. There is one last loose end to tie up, and that is to find out the stance on the pyramids of those tasked to guard and maintain them, the members of the religious death ritual cults themselves. Since we cannot literally ask any ancient Egyptians, or even any authentic Mayans, since both of these cultures have long since ceased to persevere in their peak forms, we must resort to asking the modern equivalents to their speculative craft, builders' guilds at the times when monumental building programs have been commenced and pyramids have been the chosen model. The primary target cult for questioning should be the Illuminati, comprised of radical libertine anarchists who are anti-state and anti-church alike, and whose chief symbol is the eye in the triangle, the reverse side of the U.S. Great Seal. Two Illuminati Freemasons, at the time, the adoption of this seal by Franklin, whom accepted it while in France, meant one thing: a positive acceptance of and agreement with their goals. However, by the time Franklin returned to America, the situation was different. The symbol was transformed from opposed to and against to advocate for and in favor of. The symbol of the eye in the triangle was essentially a symbol for anti-federalists to unite against. It symbolized pharaonic dominance of one man's will over another, an issue the Constitution's framers were divided on, between the rock of the tyranny of King George of England and the hard place of managing a population nearly one half of whom were slave owners. However, rarely is one found whom is both enlightened transcendentally and a member of the Illuminati. 5D4A. The ancient cults today, pre-Catholic. The various pantheist religions of old have largely dispersed, with only Voodoo, Aboriginal, Hindu, Zoroastrian, and Sheik still being the primary upholders to this day of a pantheon of deities. The dispersion of world religious beliefs by population is grossly lopsided in favor of monotheist religious beliefs and practices. If one were to count Buddhism as a pantheism, the ratio would still be 19.45% to 54.56%, respectively, as per the 7 billion or so of the world's total present population today, if put head-to-head between pantheists versus monotheists. This ratio is outrageously small, considering that Buddhism is not a pantheism. It's barely even really a religion, in the sense of mass rituals and public morality lessons. I think of Buddhism as more of a philosophy, as they say nowadays. Insofar as Catholicism's big gripe with Gnostic Christians was that they were pantheists, this should come as a vast relief to anyone Catholic. Now you know better. Gnostic Christians are not pantheists. This, of course, can't make up for the Crusades, Inquisition, Spanish conquistadors, and Jesuit assassins. But it's a nice start. Good one, Roman Papal Catholic Christians. In reality, the pantheist tradition has only been temporarily submerged and has been forced to go underground to escape total annihilation at the hands of their sworn mortal enemies, the Catholic papacy, the modern emperors of Roman Christendom. Those true believers in pantheons are resurgent, like Atlantis rising, in this new age of Aquarius, and, rightly, pit against this small minority, equal in numbers and opposite in intent, opposing them arbitrarily. The monotheist pope, always chosen for their closeted pantheist tendencies, has been complicit throughout historical succession of those to wear the mitre, in infiltrating for the purpose of subverting their own monotheist competition, the Protestants. By fostering the Protestants into the hardened Roman legionnaires' sensibility in favor of the nationalist patriotism necessary to goad the population toward a massive public works campaign or toward war, the papacy hopes to turn Protestantism against its own moral common senses, to turn them for the New World Order, blindingly. 5D, 4B, the more modern cults. Post-Masonry. Freemasonry is, at heart, a Protestant operation. It was founded by the precursors to Martin Luther, nailing his 95 Theses to the door of the All Saints' Church in Wittenberg, and is maintained by those now whose spirit is already evolved beyond the need for the patriarchal and oppressive Catholic papacy. The tide, albeit mixed between partially all pantheists and collectively most monotheists, against the Zionist nationalism cult within the Catholic papacy, has turned. To calculate those same figures, if Catholic Christians are 16.99% and their combined mutual enemies are the remaining 83.01%, then there is little concept of open competition in which the majority of such a rank could be expected to lose. There are literally still more pantheists, Buddhist included, than Catholics. However, this should not shock you. Masonry being predominantly Protestant in its Christian aspects, as opposed to devoutly Catholic, because, as you know, Masons and the papacy are sworn enemies. However, it should also be noted that Protestantism takes up only 5.78%, the smallest slice of the figurative pie, compared to pantheists and Catholics. Could Aboriginal, Voodoo, Zoroastrian, Hindus and Sheiks, non-Buddhist pantheists, combine with Protestantism to outnumber Catholicism? The result of such a rebalancing comes to 19.39% non-Buddhist pantheists, to 16.99% Catholics, which still makes it a tough battle. So long as the remaining other 63.62% of the population remain silent on the issue of pantheism versus Catholicism, we can begin to enter evidence on the metempsychosis of the soul after the body's physical death. 5D 4C. The mythologies maintained in these cults. The mythologies of Catholicism and Freemasonry differ in detail, but not in intent. They are taught as lessons to improve one's moral fortitude. They are not meant to be a moral guilt trip, with salvation from boredom held out over your head for you to dance after, like a carrot on a stick held out in front of a mule. The sacraments of the Catechism and the working tools of the craft degrees are no different in their intention to import a set of moral guidelines for the individual. Although they use the same basic premises, the same basic structural hierarchies for the rank and phylum, etc., Masonry and papacy are opposed. Why should a priest class, tasked to maintain the heritage of an architectural edifice, make enemies with the supposed builders of that very edifice? If the papacy feels the need to control Mount Zion geopolitically, strategically behind the scenes backing the US DoD and Israeli Mossad, and spiritually usurping the rightfully empty sepulchre of God by inserting into his place the politics of Rome, then should it not ought first ask permission to do so from the remaining Knights Templar, both the Maltese and Knights Columbus chapters, let alone Israel's indigenous residents, and beg forgiveness from all the others it has wronged and slain throughout this last aeon? When will the Pope repent? Conclusion. What remains unknown. Ultimately, even those who claim that knowledge is power are impotent themselves in the face of their own mortality. You can't know your way out of death. Knowing something does not give you power over someone else for their not knowing it. That is slavery, and can only enslave all who practice it. Secret societies are only necessary during times of prevalent deceit. They are not meant to become a power basis. When they do, a monumental public works program or a war will follow. But neither of these will ultimately benefit the people who realize them. All these things we can state with at least some degree of certainty as positive truth. However, what remains unknown, we cannot know at all. We cannot imagine it. We cannot conceive of it. We cannot even assert it exists. This we can say we know. But even saying these things about the unknown limits the unknown in a way counterintuitive to the spirit of these statements. Thus, we cannot even say we know there is an unknown, because there just as easily might not be, and we are simply imagining that we do not already know everything that can be known by us. In short, it is wisdom to know God, and thus, to know God, all we must do is forget self. If we forget we are ourself, we will remember we are God. Again, this can be asserted as a known and proven method for understanding wisdom and knowing God. However, what does it mean for the self to know God? This is what cannot have only one answer for everyone. Likewise, when dealing with the pyramid-building cultures of antiquity, there are things we know and things we don't know. And when we say we don't know them, it means we suspect them, and might posit them hypothetically, with utmost strident belief even, but that ultimately we accept the fact they might not prove true. Then, if there is one most elusive concept for our species, it is certainly quid est veritas. How do we define reality for others? And if we ultimately cannot, or should not, why should we desire to attempt it to start with? So it comes down to with asking, why did mankind build the pyramids? We can know who built them, how they were built, and why the people who built them wanted them built. But we cannot explain to the bricks themselves, this is the purpose you serve. This is why you were hewn and placed, to exist for this reason, at this moment in time, and to perform this exact function. Because we cannot say with any real certainty what that function is. Perhaps, ultimately, there is no function, and they are only exactly what they appear to be to the eye, a very large pile of very large cubed bricks. Perhaps they are just, and justly only, art for art's own sake. There are, in solving mysteries, always hunches and clues to guide us. However, there are knowns and known unknowns, and then, beyond this, is the great unknown. To this abyss I leave you now, gentle readers, hoping that I have imparted some small amount of new information to you, and helped inspire you to continue to seek onward along your quest to learn more.